Most gardens are designed to be replanted every year. That means more work, more spending, and more dependence, season after season. But there's another way to grow food, a simpler way. One that people used long before seed racks and seasonal resets became the norm. Some plants don't ask to be replanted. You place them once, and they come back on their own, year after year, quietly giving you food with less effort. Today we're looking at 12 plants you can plant once and harvest for years. Not rare, not complicated, just often overlooked. Welcome to Forbidden Garden Secrets. Here, we uncover forgotten plant knowledge, hidden garden truths, and simple practices that help you grow safer, wiser, and more independent, right where you live. Let's start with a plant that almost grows itself. Walking onions, Allium ex proliferum. Walking onions are one of those plants that feel almost unreal the first time you see them. Instead of producing seeds like most onions, they grow small bulb clusters right on top of their stems. When those bulbils become heavy, the plant bends down. The bulbs touch the soil, and new plants take root on their own. That's where the name comes from. It doesn't walk, but it spreads itself forward, season after season, without you having to replant anything. This simple behavior turns walking onions into one of the easiest perennial food plants you can grow. Once established, they return every year, even in colder climates, offering green onion tops in spring and fall, and small onion bulbs you can harvest when needed. For home gardeners, this means fewer trips to the store and less time starting crops from scratch. It's the kind of plant that quietly teaches you what a low-effort, high-return garden can look like. They don't need fancy soil or special care. Just a sunny spot, decent drainage, and a little space to spread. The only thing most people don't realize is how quickly they multiply. If you let them, they'll slowly expand into nearby areas, turning one small planting into a reliable onion patch over the years. And that idea of a plant that gently claims space for you leads perfectly into the next one. A crop that stays rooted for decades once you give it a proper home. Asparagus, Asparagus officinalis. Asparagus is one of the clearest examples of planting with patience in mind. When you plant asparagus crowns, you're not thinking in seasons, you're thinking in years. It takes time to establish, but once it does, it can produce fresh spears for 15 to 25 years in the same spot. That's a long-term relationship between you and a plant, and most people aren't taught to plan their gardens that way anymore. The reward is consistency. Each spring, asparagus pushes up from the same roots, right when most gardens are still waking up. You don't need to replant it. You don't need to start seeds every year. You simply learn when to harvest, when to let it grow back, and how to give it space to store energy for the next season. Over time, this rhythm becomes part of your garden routine, predictable, reliable, and surprisingly low effort. Asparagus does ask for one thing in return: a permanent place. It doesn't like being moved, and it doesn't do well in crowded beds. If you give it a dedicated corner with good sunlight and well-drained soil, it will quietly take care of the rest. And once you experience what it's like to harvest food from the same plant year after year, the next perennial on our list will start to make even more sense. Rhubarb, Rheum rhabarbarum. Rhubarb is one of those plants that looks ornamental but behaves like a food source that doesn't ask much in return. Once it's settled into the ground, it comes back every year with thick, sturdy stalks that can be harvested season after season. In many old gardens, rhubarb was treated almost like a permanent fixture, planted once, then relied on for decades without much attention. What makes rhubarb especially practical is how early it shows up. While many plants are still struggling to wake up after winter, rhubarb is already pushing fresh growth from the soil. That early return makes it valuable in a self-reliant garden, because it stretches your growing season without extra effort. You don't have to plan new seedlings or replant beds. The plant remembers where it lives. Rhubarb prefers rich soil and a bit of space to spread its large leaves. But beyond that, it's surprisingly resilient. Once established, it handles cold well and doesn't need constant care. Over time, it becomes one of those plants you forget to worry about. It's simply there when you need it, and that sense of reliability carries into the next plant on our list, which offers something green and fresh long before most gardens are ready to give anything back. Perennial kale. Most people think of kale as a plant you grow once, harvest, and then pull out at the end of the season. But perennial kale quietly breaks that pattern. Varieties like Taunton Dean don't die back after 1 year. They keep growing, producing new leaves over multiple seasons if the climate allows. This turns a familiar vegetable into something closer to a long-term food source, not just a seasonal crop. Instead of starting from seed every spring, you're learning how to manage a living plant that keeps giving. You harvest leaves as needed, allow it to regrow, and gradually shape the plant over time. In mild climates, perennial kale can become a small, permanent bush of greens in your garden. Always there when you need something fresh, without the constant cycle of planting and replacing. It prefers good light and decent soil, but it doesn't demand perfection. The real shift here is mental. You stop treating leafy greens as disposable crops and start seeing them as part of the garden's long-term structure. And once you get comfortable harvesting from the same plant over and over again, the next perennial will feel even more natural, especially one that brings a bright, fresh flavor back to your plate year after year. Sorrel is one of those plants people often mistake for a weed, simply because it's tough, fast-growing, and shows up where other plants struggle. But in a perennial garden, that resilience becomes an advantage. Once planted, sorrel returns year after year with fresh, tender leaves that can be harvested repeatedly without harming the plant. It doesn't ask for much, just a spot in the ground and a little room to settle in. What makes sorrel especially useful is how early it grows. Long before many vegetables are ready, sorrel is already offering bright green leaves with a sharp, lemony flavor. That early return can quietly change how you experience your garden, because you're no longer waiting for everything to start from zero each spring. The plant is already there, already working for you. Sorrel handles partial shade, uneven soil, and less than perfect conditions better than most leafy greens. Over time, it becomes one of those reliable plants you stop worrying about. You simply step outside and harvest what you need. And once you see how something so simple can provide steady food year after year, it makes sense to look next at a plant that spreads easily and brings sweetness back to the garden without being replanted. Strawberries are often treated like delicate plants that come and go, but in reality, they behave more like quiet settlers. Once established, they send out runners that root themselves into the soil, creating new plants without any effort from you. Over time, a small patch can turn into a living carpet of fruit-producing plants that return every season on their own. This natural spreading is what makes strawberries so valuable in a long-term garden. You're not starting from scratch each year. You're managing a patch that renews itself, slowly filling in empty spaces and producing fruit season after season. With just a bit of thinning and occasional care, strawberries can keep producing for years, especially if you refresh the bed by letting young runners replace older plants. They like sun and well-drained soil, but they're surprisingly adaptable once they settle in. The main thing to watch is overcrowding. Too many plants competing in the same space can reduce fruit size over time. Still, when you step back and see strawberries quietly multiplying and feeding you year after year, it changes how you think about fruit in the garden. And from spreading plants, it's a natural shift to shrubs that return every season with deeper roots and even longer lifespans. Blueberries don't look like much when you first plant them. They start small, slow, and almost underwhelming. But over time, they become one of the most reliable fruit sources you can build into a garden. Once established, a blueberry bush can produce for decades, returning every year with berries that require far less work than most annual crops. What makes blueberries especially valuable in a long-term garden is how predictable they become. You learn their rhythm, when they flower, when the berries ripen, and how much you can harvest without stressing the plant. With each passing season, the bush grows stronger, not weaker. That slow, steady growth is exactly what makes perennial plants such a powerful foundation for a self-reliant garden. Blueberries do have one specific preference. They like acidic soil. If your soil is naturally alkaline, you may need to amend it or grow them in prepared beds or containers. Once that condition is met, they're surprisingly low maintenance. And when you experience what it's like to harvest fruit from the same plant year after year, the next shrub on the list will feel like a natural extension of that long-term way of thinking about your garden. Raspberries, rubiceae. Raspberries grow with a kind of confidence that surprises most first-time gardeners. Once they settle in, they send up new canes from the ground year after year, creating a living patch that renews itself without being replanted. What looks like one plant slowly becomes a productive thicket, offering fresh fruit every season if you give it even basic care. This natural spreading is what makes raspberries such a strong long-term food plant. You're not restarting each year, you're guiding a patch that already knows how to survive in your soil and climate. With simple pruning, you can shape how dense the patch becomes and encourage better fruiting, turning what could become tangled growth into a dependable source of berries. Raspberries prefer sun and decent drainage, but they're resilient once established. The main thing to understand is their habit of spreading beyond where you first planted them. If you don't set boundaries, they'll slowly claim more ground than you planned. That spreading nature is both their strength and their challenge, and it leads well into the next plant, which also offers long-term harvests, but in a more contained, bush-like form. Red currants are one of those quiet fruit bushes that rarely get the attention they deserve. They don't look dramatic when you plant them, and they don't demand much care. But once established, they return every year with clusters of bright berries that hang from the branches like small lanterns. In older gardens, these shrubs were often planted along fences and forgotten until harvest time came around. What makes red currants so practical is their balance between effort and reward. You don't need to replant them. You don't need to fuss over them constantly. You simply learn when to prune lightly, how to let sunlight reach the branches, and when the berries are ready to pick. Over time, the bush becomes part of the structure of your garden, not something you start over with every season. Red currants handle cooler climates well and tolerate partial shade better than many fruiting plants. Once they're rooted in, they quietly produce for years with minimal attention. And as you move from these long-lived shrubs, it's natural to shift toward plants that feel even more permanent. Ones that don't just return each season, but can anchor a garden bed for years to come. Artichokes are one of those plants that change how a garden looks and feels the moment they're planted. They grow tall, broad, and architectural, almost like living sculptures. But beyond their dramatic appearance, they're also long-term food plants. In the right climate, an artichoke plant can return year after year, producing large edible buds with very little effort once established. What makes artichokes interesting in a self-reliant garden is how much they give compared to how little they ask for. You don't replant them each season. You protect them through colder months if needed, and they come back stronger when the weather warms. Over time, a single plant can become a steady source of food and a permanent part of your garden layout. They do best in sunny spots with well-drained soil and a bit of space to spread their large leaves. In colder climates, they may need winter protection or to be treated as short-lived perennials. But even then, the experience of harvesting from the same plant across multiple seasons changes how you think about vegetables. And from these large, anchored plants, it's a natural step toward another perennial that grows underground and quietly stores food for you year after year. Jerusalem artichokes, Helianthus tuberosus. Jerusalem artichokes look like cheerful sunflowers above the ground, but their real value is hidden below the soil. Once you plant them, they store food in underground tubers that come back year after year, often with more vigor than you expect. In many traditional gardens, they were treated as a reliable backup crop, something that kept producing even when other plants struggled. What makes Jerusalem artichokes powerful in a long-term garden is how independent they are. You don't replant them. You don't start seeds each spring. You simply harvest some tubers and leave a few behind, and the patch renews itself naturally. Over time, this creates a dependable source of food that doesn't rely on seasonal planning or constant attention. There is one important reality to understand. Jerusalem artichokes spread aggressively. If you give them free rein, they can take over a space faster than you expect. The key is to plant them where their growth is contained or where spreading is actually welcome. That balance between abundance and control is something every self-reliant garden has to learn. And it sets the stage for the final plant on our list, which also grows underground, but behaves in a more contained, intentional way. Oca, New Zealand yam, Oxalis tuberosa. Oca is one of those crops that feels unfamiliar to many gardeners, even though it's been grown for centuries in other parts of the world. Instead of producing above-ground fruit or leaves, it stores its food underground in colorful tubers that you can harvest season after season if you manage the plant well. In climates that suit it, OCA can be replanted from small leftover tubers, slowly building a reliable source of food over time. What makes OCA valuable in a long-term garden is how quietly it fits into spaces where other crops struggle. It tolerates cooler temperatures, grows low to the ground, and doesn't demand rich soil to produce something useful. Over time, it becomes part of a pattern of planting that favors continuity, saving a portion of each harvest to ensure the plant returns the following year without relying on new purchases. Oca does best in climates with mild summers and longer growing seasons, and it rewards patience more than speed. It's not a plant you rush. Instead, it teaches you to think in cycles. Harvest some, save some, and let the plant's rhythm shape your garden. And that idea of planning beyond a single season brings us naturally to the bigger question. What kind of garden are you really building over time? When you step back and look at these plants together, a pattern starts to appear. A garden doesn't have to be something you rebuild from zero every year. It can be something you slowly invest in. One root, one crown, one bush at a time, until the garden itself begins to work for you. Perennial plants change your relationship with food. They teach you to think in years instead of weeks, in continuity instead of constant replacement. Over time, that shift brings more than just harvests. It brings stability, resilience, and a quieter kind of independence right in your own backyard. You don't need to plant everything at once. Even choosing one perennial to start with is enough to begin changing how your garden behaves. The important part is noticing that there's another way to grow, one that asks for patience up front and gives back for years to come. If this helped you see your garden differently, subscribe to Forbidden Garden Secrets and turn on notifications. We're bringing forgotten plant knowledge back, one garden at a time. See you in the next video.